Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Peter Locke. I'm faculty in Global Health Studies here at Northwestern, and I'm happy to welcome you to the final event of the year in our ongoing speaker series, generously supported by the Provost's Hollister Lecture Fund. Thank you especially to our program assistant, Lauren Carr, for their dedicated work in making all of this happen. And on a quick side note, if you're interested in our amazing past speakers, most of our events were recorded and can be found on our website. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Roberto Barrios, Professor of Anthropology, and Doris Zemurray Stone Chair for Latin American Studies at the University of New Orleans. Dr. Barrios has researched disaster risk reduction and recovery since 1999 through fieldwork in a variety of locations in Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, the U.S. Midwest, and the U.S. Gulf South. Using ethnographic methods, Dr. Barrios' work has focused on documenting the voices of disaster survivors with specific attention to the categories through which they define successful disaster recovery and the ways they narrate the connection between sensory experience and the built, social, and natural environments. He is the author of Governing Affect, Neoliberalism and Disaster Reconstruction, and co-editor of the anthology Disaster Upon Disaster, Exploring the Gap Between Knowledge, Policy, and Practice. He is also co-editor of the Berghahn book series Catastrophes in Context. His talk today is entitled A Revelatory Pandemic, From the Anthropology of Disasters to the Anthropology of Epidemics. Please join me in giving him our warmest welcome.
Well, thanks everyone for taking the time from your very busy days to be here. I'd like to thank Noel Sullivan and Peter Locke for the wonderful invitation to come to your campus and share with you about my work. I think expectations are what can lead to disappointment, so I want to set some expectations first of this presentation. I've done a lot of work that is deeply ethnographic and highly textured, that is very data-driven, but today's presentation is mostly about concepts. But everything that I'm going to be talking about is backed by rich data, both sometimes ethnographic, sometimes also quantitative. So if you have any questions about data to back this up, I can always go into it. But mostly we're going to be talking about ideas. And we will hear about some facts, we will hear about some numbers, we will hear about some details. But sometimes I tell my students that what's most important, because something like disasters are interdisciplinary disciplines, right? So there are sociologists of disasters, there are anthropologists of disasters, there's even people who are now disaster specialists, right? You can go to certain universities and just study disaster risk management. And one of the things that's important is, why do you choose a particular discipline to study? And I know that this program is probably interdisciplinary, right? So the interdisciplinarity is good, but sometimes it's also good to think about how to frame and how to think, right? Because I think that's what's most important out of a university education. It's not only learning a bunch of facts, learning a bunch of numbers, but learning this thing that we call critical thinking. Learning how to structure your analyses and therefore how to think. And so one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today is how to think in a distinctly anthropological way. At least I'll make the argument that these are distinctly anthropological ways of thinking about three broad concepts or ideas: disasters, crisis, and epidemics, right? So I'm trying to set your expectations, and that's what we're going to focus on. That's what I'll be talking about at length. And over the course of that conversation, we'll look at some other specific, we'll look at a bunch of things. But let me tell you a little bit about myself first, in addition to what Professor Locke already said. I think if I thought about what are the tendencies that have qualified or characterized my career in my education as an anthropologist, I think I first begin with a deep love for migration studies, and that probably comes from very personal lived experience. I was not born in the United States. I was born in a country called Guatemala. And my family migrated when I was 13 years old. And that was a transformative, sometimes painful, sometimes traumatic, but also an experience to which I owe many things. I think that if my family had not migrated to the United States, I never would have had the experience of what it means to be a racialized other. And I think that experience, sometimes of discrimination, led me to study anthropology, asking the questions like, why do we do these things? So I probably would not have become an anthropologist. And I probably wouldn't be the person that I am heading up in for migration. But also, as we'll talk partly about today, Guatemala, as you may have known, suffered a very traumatic 36-year civil war. And one of the questions that I always had was, why did that war have to happen? And anthropology also had the explanations for it. It had everything to do with racism, ethnocentrism, imposed ideas about development that indigenous populations that the supposed underdevelopment of Central American indigenous populations were blamed for, that resulted in an ethnocidal civil war. And I was not given the tools for thinking about that. I could not understand why racism happened. I knew that I participated in it. I knew that sometimes I had a privileged position, and I myself was a victim of racism. I had also perpetrated it, and other isms, sexism, homophobia, and I was desperately looking for a discipline to help me understand why do people do that, right? And what other worlds are possible, and that's what drove me to anthropology. So migration was something that really fascinated me, and I was particularly interested in the forced migration of indigenous people from Guatemala. Somewhere around between 300,000 and 500,000 indigenous people were forcefully displaced. Many of them were not recognized by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And the United States, of course, was clandestinely funding the genocidal processes that has resulted in the destruction of 400 indigenous communities. Therefore, informal migrants or unrecognized refugees, and even if you were recognized refugees, the U.S. State Department did not grant Guatemalans political asylum, because to recognize that Guatemalans were asylees would be to recognize that a country's military dictatorship that they saw as friendly was actually perpetrating heinous crimes with a lot of clandestine support on their part. So looking at issues of migration were kind of my first love in graduate school. And also an interest in medical anthropology. My Master's of Art project was doing an ethnographic project of the occurrence of neural tube birth defects among Cancubal Maya refugees and immigrants in South Florida. And I wanted to continue to study this. I wanted to do a comparative study, look at issues of community health and adolescent health and child and adolescent development among Guatemalan Mayans in South Florida and in the refugee camps of Chiapas, where many of them had remained 15 years after the conflict. For a variety of reasons I don't have time to get into right now, I didn't end up doing that project. Things were too complex in Chiapas. I wanted to carry out the project, but my dissertation advisor said, that situation's too hot. We don't know if it's going to get really violent. We won't support your dissertation project if you want to work there. Find another project. And that was 1998. Perhaps some of you all had not been born yet in 1998, if you're undergrads. And in that year, unfortunately, Hurricane Mitch struck Honduras. And I felt that maybe I could transfer a lot of the methods and a lot of the questions that I had to looking at the recovery process, and especially because I was a graduate student at the University of Florida with Noel. And at the University of Florida, a person who gets a lot of credit in disaster anthropology, Anthony Oliver Smith, was a professor there, and he and another medical anthropologist I had worked very closely with, James P. Stansbury, put together a project to use the methods of anthropology and theories of anthropology to study the Reconstruction process and see what we could contribute. So my dissertation project starts as a very strongly medical anthropology project. We're going to use the tools of nutritional epidemiology. We collected a lot of data. I did 230 household interviews. I measured 230 children under 5 years of age, trying to use anthropometry as a barometer of community health in the aftermath of the disaster. But as we'll see today, when I ended up writing my dissertation, many deeply political issues began to concern me about this concept that we today call resilience. In the early 2000s, we weren't using the term resilience left and right, talking about disasters. But it turns out that what I ended up looking at, which was communities that in the aftermath of disaster were following dramatically different paths, some towards reconstruction and some towards a continued disaster, that helped me really think about and think critically about the concept of resilience. So I wrote some articles about that. So if you're interested in that, I can also share those citations later on. That work is highly ethnographic in detail. So that's a little bit about me. And so these three tendencies, medical anthropology, disaster anthropology, and migration, have deeply interested me. And, some of these things you probably have already discussed in class already, because you have amazing faculty that work in issues of sociology of disasters and health, right? And you get courses on disasters here already. So I hope this isn't too repetitive, but just thinking about how to bridge the perceived gap, perhaps there isn't a gap between the anthropology of disasters and anthropology of epidemics and what they might have in common. I have more recently really developed myself as a professional in the field of the anthropology of disasters. And sometimes you really don't see a lot of discussion of epidemics at times, right? A lot of disaster anthropologists focus tremendously on what we call natural hazards, the aftermath, or what leads up to earthquakes, floods, hurricanes. I had memory of at least one anthropologist sometimes mentioning epidemics, Gregory Button, in one of his books, Disaster Culture. But sometimes there's this sentiment that the two lines of inquiry have remained somewhat separate. For example, Frederick Keck recently published an edited volume titled The Anthropology of Epidemics, right? That drew a clear line in terms of what some people might call disasters and epidemics, and that's an edited volume by the press Routledge, for example. But one of the things that I want to talk about today is how when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and perhaps this is because all of us in a way became participant observers as anthropologists, we were actually living the pandemic, many anthropologists of disasters felt that they had a lot to say about the pandemic, right? We didn't blatantly identify ourselves as medical anthropologists. We haven't necessarily been writing about medical anthropology, about medical issues or explicitly health issues, but we all saw many familiar things, and we all felt we had a lot to say. And I'll talk about, one of the things I'll talk about today is an edited volume that I recently published, and that I'll put up titled A Revelatory Pandemic. And it's looking at the pandemic from the perspective of anthropologists of disasters, and particularly in the context of Latin America. So that's what half of the presentation will be about. So thinking about the things that are in common between disasters and epidemics, I think that both involve the interaction of socioeconomic and political factors in a non-human agent, right? I think that from the COVID pandemic, we all understand that a virus alone does not a pandemic make, right? Humans can mobilize it, right? We can also create environments that are more conducive to contagion, right? There are practices that we can engage in as humans to limit that contagion. In an ideal world, in a utopian ideal world, if we had all gone into isolation, if we had all had enough resources to feed ourselves for perhaps a month, we could have brought COVID to an end, right? If we had completely frozen social behavior, and if we had the political will of governments to make that happen, right? So a virus alone does not a pandemic make, right? And the same thing applies also to disasters, as we understand disasters as anthropologists. And perhaps not for you all who are very well learned, and you have amazing professors and classes, but sometimes in the public at large, and also in the discourse of mass media, on many occasions, disasters get reduced to the hazard, right? And they even get named after the hazards, right? Hurricane Katrina, right? The earthquake of 1976. And often there's also this temporal element to disasters, that the idea is that the disaster begins when the hazard presents itself. The earthquake of 1976, right, begins supposedly at a particular time when when a particular fault line moves. Hurricane Katrina begins when the hurricane makes landfall. And one of the things that we'll see is that often the hazard might be the least powerful variable in the making of a disaster, right? An earthquake that's 7 in the Richter scale magnitude hits Kobe, Japan. No one will die, right? Proper seismic construction techniques have been applied, and certainly there could be much stronger earthquakes that manifest, but a magnitude 7 earthquake will not necessarily a disaster make. Yet a magnitude 7 earthquake hits Guatemala in 1976, and it pretty much destroys the country, right? Kills 25,000 people, right? So the point is that often in the popular mindset, the disaster gets reduced to the natural hazard, when the natural hazard might be the least of the ingredients, and also that in terms of how the ingredients of a disaster are put in place, or the different variables of a disaster, often temporally they expand long before the hazard manifests itself. And I would argue the same applies for epidemics, right? A virus might be the last thing that needs to show up, but many of the social and historical and environmental factors are put in place long before that. And so understanding both epidemics and disasters as processes, I think, is a very important lesson from anthropology that has tremendous implications for global health policy. And I hope I'll highlight that as we go along. The other one is that both are subject to moral judgments, right? So in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, evangelical preacher, director of a major non-governmental organization that does a lot of disaster work, Franklin Graham, said that Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans because of all the sex stuff going on and the wild orgies in New Orleans. And I live in New Orleans, and I don't know where these orgies are. But certainly disasters, and also when it comes to illness and disease, right? For example, with HIV, sometimes we anthropologists talk about HIV having an excess of meaning, because sometimes the social death that you die when you have an HIV diagnosis is even more difficult for people to live with than the actual biological death that you could possibly suffer. And I think that sometimes even keeps people from getting themselves diagnosed, right? It's not necessarily what the disease will do to your body, but the social stigmatization that will accompany it. So I think those are things that they share. And like I said, both are temporally prolonged processes, right? That in fact extend long beyond what we in the public often think about. And I think we also need to think about the COVID pandemic in the same way, right? The COVID pandemic, some people have titled it the first crisis of the Anthropocene, that moved at record speed around the world through many of the highways of trade and the social communication and movement that we had built in terms of our global political economy over the decades that preceded it. And finally, they are both things that befall the population. If I remember in my graduate courses in epidemiology, right? Epidemiology is literally that which befalls the population, and disasters are also things that befall population and have tremendous implications for morbidity and mortality. And finally, both are represented as crises, and that's what I want to focus on right now, crises. A little bit of background on disasters. You probably got a lot of this, but I just think it's important when we think about what is it that a crisis is. And a lot of the information that's coming is from a publication that I was invited to contribute to the Annual Review of Anthropology back in 2014. Back in 2014, the Annual Review of Anthropology reached out to me. I was really honored because that's a journal that's by invitation only. And they asked me to contribute the next piece on the anthropology of disasters. And previously, there had only been one piece in the late 1990s and 1996 written by Anthony Oliver Smith, who was my mentor, and for me it was a great honor to be asked after him to contribute a piece on disasters and anthropology. But they said that they wanted it framed within the context of the crises. So, wanted to do my due diligence, I reached out to my network of disaster scholars, and I said, hey, I've been asked to write this article for the Annual Review of Anthropology on the subject of crises and disasters. Anyone has any things that they think I should look at? If you've published anything on the subject, please send it to me. And I was surprised that I received a lot of negative comments and almost backlash. Some disaster anthropologists were saying, oh, the concept of crisis doesn't work. It's more jargon. We really shouldn't use it when we talk about disasters. It's a waste of time. But the truth is, when I started looking beyond the work of disaster anthropologists, I found, as we'll see, that other anthropologists who were disaster anthropologists, cultural anthropologists like Janet Reutemann and Joseph Masco had a lot of things and Akila Mbembe had a lot of things to say about crisis. So I started exploring that literature. And this is the narrative that emerged out of that, right? That when we look at disasters in the anthropological literature, on many occasions, they're represented as acts of God in the Dresden Codex of the classic period of the post-classic Maya, for example. Droughts that affected classic Maya people in the 8th century are represented as these beasts that are coming down from the planet Mars, and all these planets and cosmological beings are associated with divinities, right? And also in the Western tradition within Christianity, in the Old Testament, we can find the wrath of God often manifesting as pests at times, but also as disasters. But in the history of anthropological thought on disasters, the 1755 triple disaster in the city of Lisbon often stands out as this watershed event. Where you have an earthquake that topples the city, that triggers a tsunami, and then there's an urban fire. And this is a period of the Enlightenment where philosophers like Immanuel Kant are coming up with his ideas about nature sublime. And that's where the concept of natural disasters comes up. Philosophers go to Lisbon and observe the destruction, and it's their idea is that the disaster and the destruction is so pervasive that it doesn't seem God is punishing anyone in particular. It can't be attributed to God. Therefore, this concept of nature is emerging also in terms of Western natural philosophy. So the concept of natural disasters emerges. Part of the challenge, as y'all probably know from taking your courses already, is that the concept of natural disasters often attributes the causation, the root cause of a disaster to a phenomenon that's external to society, right? Nature. Nature is supposed to be outside of society. Therefore, people like Anthony Oliver Smith have argued that the mentality that gave rise to was the idea that disasters were not preventable. Disasters were things that the best that we could do is prepare to respond to them. And that idea is still very heavily ingrained in our institutions and our mentality. For example, we do not have a disaster prevention agency in the United States. We have a federal emergency management agency, right? We respond to disasters after they happen, or at least that's the representation of the institution, not necessarily an institution that is assigned to actually prevent them. In Mexico, the national agency in charge of disaster is called CENAPRED, and that is the National Center for Disaster Prevention, right? But in the United States, we still have the idea of emergency and of emergency response. And the concept of natural disasters remains until the 1970s, and at least in the anthropology of disasters, and I welcome other citations or other ideas people may have. But this article that was published in the journal Nature by Phil O'Keefe, Ken Westgate, and Ben Wisner is often thought of as being another kind of watershed event in terms of the history of how we think about disasters. And what these were critical geographers, and they just did a meta-analysis of disasters. In the 1970s, most disasters were associated mostly with the global south. Some parts of Europe were thought to be disaster-free. And I think in the United States also, though there were disasters, the idea was that there was a strong notion that disasters occurred in the global south in places that were former colonies. And through their tabulations, these geographers noticed that something really interesting was happening, right? What was happening was that severity of hazard did not predict extent of damage, extent of mortality, extent of economic losses. Therefore, they claim that social historical factors are perhaps even more important, and particularly, what we call political ecological factors are more important variables involved in shaping a disaster. But if we read the article, I mean, this is coming out in Nature, and it's actually pretty radical, because one of the things that they say is that that the majority of these disasters are happening in the global south, and the reason that they're happening is because of the historic extractive economies that go back to colonialism and were perpetuated in the post-independence period, which I think is a pretty radical thing to say, right? I think we've gotten less radical, and especially as disaster studies have become kind of formalized and now highly professionalized. There's been a lot of, another key word that we'll be looking at, depoliticization of how we think about disasters and even pandemics, right? And most importantly, one of the key example that they use is a 1976 earthquake that happened in Guatemala. As an example of the historical political ecologies that go back to colonialism and are perpetuated, particularly through liberal and eventually neoliberal forms of capitalism and capitalist models of development that extract and don't reinvest and actually have the environmental impacts that end up creating the conditions that then, when the last ingredient of a disaster shows up, a disaster happens, right? So it's a real radical statement that they're making, right? And the other thing that they're pointing out, that there's the potential of this article, is that they're saying that most of the elements of disaster is not external to society, it's deeply ingrained within society, it's deeply socially made to a great extent, not completely, but to a great extent. So if they are, to a great extent, made by humans, then we humans have agency. That's perhaps my optimism, right? And maybe it's an ill-placed optimism. We have agency. It is within our power to greatly mitigate or prevent these things. And as we'll see, then becomes a political question, whether the political will exists to mitigate them before they occur or prevent them before they occur. All right, so that's a big watershed, and that article leads to a slew of research, and particularly from scholars of Latin America. I know that I mentioned Anthony Oliver Smith, and Anthony Oliver Smith is a great scholar, but also we got to give credit because one of the things that Anthony Oliver Smith did is that he also translated a lot of ideas that were brewing by third world scholars, people like Virginia-García Acosta, Gustavo Wilches-Chaus, a lot of Latin American social scientists and lawyers contributed to making the theory of vulnerability that then gets translated to English by Anthony Oliver Smith. And so with no disrespect to Anthony Oliver Smith, but sometimes there's this tendency to give him all this credit and see him as this huge figure in a somewhat patriarchal way when there's all these people, many scholars who are women, many scholars from the global south that contributed to these ideas, right? So we don't want to fetishize scholarship. So I think that this is the reason why the COVID pandemic seems so open to theorization and to interventions on the part of disaster anthropologists, that we weren't staying in our lane. We couldn't stay in our lane because we were seeing so many familiar things, right? And there have been, I know that Paul Farmer, some of my students get upset when I cite him because he did sign, there was a horrible case of historic chronic sexual harassment, criminal, by a very well-known anthropologist, John Komaroff. And when he was at Harvard, Harvard wanted to discredit the students that were coming out against him. And all of these faculty, some really famous, some very progressive faculty signed a letter in support of him. So, don't trust the faculty, trust the students, right? Trust the victims. And Paul Farmer was one of the signatures of that letter, and so some students get really upset. So yes, I think that was very wrong of him. He was an idiot for doing that. He's now dead. But he did publish some, yeah, no, he is, serves him right? Yeah, he's dead. But, books of his, like Infections and Inequalities, right, that have made these statements. And again, we don't want to just grant Paul Farmer, because perhaps Paul Farmer is a lot like the Anthony Oliver Smith of anthropology, for medical anthropology. But just the idea, again, that a virus or a particular pathology is sometimes even the minor element of an epidemic, right? And we have to consider all the elements of socioeconomic context in terms of how socioeconomic status affects nutrition, access to proper health care, access to leisure for the ability for the care of the self, all of these things that need to be considered, right? And also thinking about Timothy Mitchell's work, who is not necessarily an epidemiologist or a medical anthropologist, but he writes this article or this book chapter called Can the Mosquito Speak that talks about malaria epidemics in the Second World War, and how it wasn't just the virus itself, but it's how the tanks, the political economy of the war is what allowed malaria to spread in the way that it did, right? So there are many things that are very similar, but also a word of caution, right? Because then the thing might be like, well, should we just blend the two together? And there might be things to consider, right? That what I'm proposing here is that we need to have perhaps more conversations between disaster anthropologists and medical anthropologists and epidemiologists, but that there might be things to consider. Viruses have particular kinds of agency, right? And they might do things as a non-human agent that maybe a fault line doesn't, right? That maybe a hurricane doesn't. So that's certainly something to consider. The agencies and human bodies, right? Some epidemics are epidemics of chronic diseases, right? That certainly have very strong socioeconomic and historical elements. Things like, non-insulin dependent diabetes, heart disease, right? And I think those are things worth considering. Also, the agencies that often are called upon to respond can be different, have different strategies or different protocols about how to respond, and certainly agencies are part, at times, of how a disaster. In the case of natural disasters, we often talk about how the disaster persists. Sometimes the processes of recovery are the disaster after the disaster, and that has a lot to do with the agencies that are responding, with their protocols, with their visions of what a disaster is. For example, one of the things that many anthropologists have noted ethnographically is that in Mexico, with the vulnerability theory, many Mexican scholars of disasters argue that inequity reduction and socioeconomic inequity reduction is disaster risk reduction. But the Federal Emergency Management Agency does not see its role as being responsible for inequity reduction. They're often very much committed to rebuilding what was already there. And sometimes what they're rebuilding is actually a lot of the vulnerability that pre-existed, right? And finally, cultural meanings that some people may have certain meanings and ideas that they have about an epidemic versus a disaster that I think are worth considering. So not necessary to conflate the two. So as I was saying, I was called upon to write this article for Annual Review of Anthropology, and I got some negative feedback from disaster anthropologists, but I saw that some and anthropologists were interested beyond disaster anthropology in the concept of crisis, and it turned out that I'm not proposing that the crisis concept should replace the disaster concept, but that there were lots of things to think about in terms of crises, and that anthropologists and disaster anthropologists were sometimes, without even knowing or implicitly, reiterating a lot of ideas that are common cultural convention about what a crisis is. So the other thing that interested me was that crisis discourse, or people speaking about COVID-19 as a crisis, was all over the place, right? So in this article from The Guardian, the director of the IMF refers to COVID as a crisis unlike any other. And one of the things that I became interested in is, what do people mean when they call something a crisis? What kinds of assumptions do we make when we refer to a pandemic as a crisis or a disaster as a crisis? So let's talk a little bit about crisis, right? So the concept of crisis there is one scholar, Reinhard Koselleck, who's this German historian of ideas, who's often credited with writing the most authoritative history of the concept of crisis. Of course, that's a very Eurocentric history, and we may want to ask, as good anthropologists, in what other languages has people spoken about similar situations? What words do they use? What cultural content do they give to them? Are there alternative histories of crisis or crisis concepts or crisis-adjacent concepts? But in the Western tradition, in the Eurocentric history of the concept, crisis has Greek roots. In the Greek context, a crisis is used to refer to a decision. And it's interesting because during disasters, people had to make lots of decisions, life and death decisions, as well as the pandemic. People had to make decisions. And in the legal field, to divorce or quarrel, but also a judgment in the legal field. And we'll see how this pops up again and again, right? In the medical field, also a decision that either leads to a patient getting better or not. And also, it's out of this idea, particularly the notion of crisis as judgment, that crisis and critique become cognate concepts. They become concepts that are intimately linked, right? In the medieval period, medieval thinkers took the meaning of the Greek meaning of crisis as judgment and applied it to what in anthropology we call Christian teleological thought. You all could talk about teleologies in your classes. Is that a foreign concept? In anthropology, a telos, or a teleological story, is when you tell a story and you already know the ending. But the truth is, we don't know what the ending of stories are until the story has ended, right? For example, if we travel back in time to November 2nd, 2016, and you read the New York Times, Hillary Clinton was supposed to win the election by a landslide. And history didn't turn out that way, right? So we never really know the endpoint of history, but something that's happened in Christian cosmology is that we have become accustomed to telling stories and thinking about history as if it was teleological. So during the medieval period, in Christian Europe, we already know the endpoint of history. Christ is coming back. Jesus is coming back. As a matter of fact, some people were justifying the war in Iran, that it's going to bring Armageddon back. I mean, so some crises can be, self-fulfilling, right? Self-fulfilling prophecies, right? But that mentality is still with us. It is very dangerous. No, don't fear the war in Iran because it's going to bring about the end of days, and we deeply need it, right? So a lot of historical thinking during the Middle Ages assumes that we already know the end point. And it ends, and history ends in a crisis. The final, and a crisis is a judgment. And most importantly, after that crisis, we got the happily ever after. Because I was raised Catholic, I was raised within the Christian tradition, and I don't know about everybody else's tradition, but as a Christian, I was led to believe that the kingdom of heaven, there won't be any gossip, there won't be any problems, right? It's utopian. There is a happily ever after. It's a world without conflicts. Human history ends. And so these ideas about crisis get integrated into what eventually becomes modernist historiography, in particular 18th century historiography. In the 18th century early historians borrow a lot of these ideas. So what develops is what we might call, I call in this book, crisis with guarantee, right? And that's borrowed from post-colonial historian Sohrab Dubey, who talks about history with warranty. And history with warranty is the idea that history has certain given outcomes, development, right, modernization, when in fact it doesn't, right? So Sohrab Dubey calls for writing histories without warranty. And this comes particularly from the way that 19th century social evolutionary theorists built upon 18th century ideas about crisis, and how crisis emerges as a historiographic element or concept, right? It's a fact that we think about history in terms of crisis. This really struck me when, during the pandemic, my wife and I are in the kitchen, and she tells me, it feels like we're actually living through history. As if every other thing that we did every day wasn't history, right? But the pandemic felt to her like a historical moment, like this is the stuff of history, right? And that gets implanted in our mentalities in the 18th century, because crises come to be seen as these points in history that also separate qualitatively different times, and that's where we get what's called an epochal notion of history. The idea that there are epochs that feel different, right? And that crises are what mark the beginning and ending of them. So that's why the pandemic, to my wife, felt like we were actually living through history. But but basically everything's history, right? But why do we come to think about it as crises, as the things that history is made of? So getting back to crisis with guarantee is the idea that the idea begins to develop in the Western way of thinking that crises have guaranteed outcomes, and they're often supposedly progressive outcomes, what we think are good, positive outcomes. Again, the final judgment, the final crisis, that's why Pete Hegseth wants it so badly, right? Because it's going to bring the kingdom of heaven. I shudder to think what the kingdom of heaven looks like to him. I think I know, I won't even go into it, right? But of course you want it, of course you desire it, right? It's a release from all the toils of being human and of the politics of human history. So crisis is always supposed to promise a better afterwards, right? And in the 18th century, this crisis gets mobilized in that way when people were speaking and writing about the American and French revolutions. These revolutions are going to bring about a utopian ever after. Of course, they don't, but that is the mentality that persists. And a lot of that kind of way of speaking and thinking about the COVID-19 crisis did manifest during the pandemic. So finally, in the 19th century social evolutionary thought, that's the thing, right? Marx claims that if you assume dialectical materialist thinking, that you can think outside of ideology, and therefore you can be objective and have agency. But the truth is that even Marx was not immune to thinking within teleological thoughts, and particularly the Marx that is the historical materialism of Marx that assumes that the history of humanity is one of unilinear development, that we're all following the same line of development towards modernity or towards capitalism, and that the idea that the communist revolution is what's going to bring about the happily ever after of the communist mode of production. So this is a mural from Mexico City that's titled The History of Mexico, that represents Mexican history from a Marxist social evolutionary perspective, where the history of Mexico is one of class struggle that leads to a final confrontation of a communist revolution in Mexico. And you have Karl Marx pointing his finger towards a utopian modernized Mexico. Mexico has never materialized and been, but that's the promise, right? That's the guarantee. The crisis has this guarantee that's going to bring about the better. But in terms of anthropological thought, and I want to make sure that I don't labor this too much. I know we got comments and everything. Oh, we still have 36 minutes. We have time. Anthropologists have also been thinking a lot about crisis. In the Manchester School, in the immediate post-war period, people like Victor Turner and Max Gluckman, before the Second World War, a lot of anthropologists could uphold the illusion, the fantasy, that people lived in communities that were somehow removed from colonialism or modernization, but that fantasy begins to fall apart in the aftermath of the Second World War, particularly in the Zambian Copper Belt and in South Africa. Certain nation states like Angola and Zambia began to take on modernist developmental ideas about national development, and begin to urge rural people to migrate to urban centers and work in economies that are going to be conducive to plugging those countries into the global capitalist economy. And that brings communities into crisis over meaning, crisis over tensions between young and old. And one of the things that they argue is that crises are methodologically opportune moments because they allow us to see things that are a lot harder to see in times of normalcy. But they're also laden with transformative potential. But these anthropologists also stress the conservative tendencies of society. So they had their own bias, that they really looked more about how the conservative elements within society always counteracted those transformative potentials. And it's not perhaps until the 1970s, with the publication of Marshall Salence's Stone Age economics, that Salins begins to look at crisis in another way. He also borrows, or not borrows, but builds the idea of the methodological opportunities afforded by crises, and he calls crises crises revelatories. He looks at one cyclone, for example, in the island of Tecopia, and calls it a crise revelatories, arguing that the cyclone allows him, as an anthropologist, to see social divisions, social hierarchies that are otherwise almost impossible to see. And also talks about the potential for transformative change, and compares different crises linked to either historical processes or, but also to disasters, and makes the claim that the revelatory crisis in the island of Tecopia did not become transformative because the agent that triggered it was an agent that is external to society, which was a cyclone. So Salins is upholding this idea, again, that disasters are external to society, right? That they're linked to the natural hazard. And he argues that in the occasions when a revelatory crisis does lead to transformative change, it's because the mode of production of a particular society has reached maturity. And so that's a distinctly Marxist way of thinking. And so he's arguing that when the contradictions of a society and of a political economy become so heavy, so laden, that then that triggers things to become a transformative process, right? So again, this whole idea that the mode of production has to reach maturity for Salins for it to have the potential for transformative change. In anthropology, but then in disaster anthropology, although disaster anthropologists said, crisis isn't helpful, don't even talk about it, it turns out that actually Anthony Oliver Smith, and particularly credit has to be given to Jacqueline Soloway, who uses the concept before he does. They both take Salins and make the claim that disasters are highly revelatory as a crisis, right? So Anthony Oliver Smith writes, that in a disaster, the fundamental features of a society and culture, I don't know how that hyphen got there, are laid bare in stark relief by the reduction of priorities to basic social, cultural, and material necessities. Again, this whole idea of what's revealed and the methodological opportunities afforded by a disaster. And he also, this resonates a lot with the classical notion of disasters as judgment, because they're one measure by which we can judge the success of adaptation to the environment. So even implicitly, a lot of ideas about crisis are in the ways that we look at disasters, even though disaster anthropologists claim that they weren't worth looking at. But the anthropologists who were not disaster anthropologists, who were thinking also about crisis, particularly Janet Roitman begins to talk about how part of the problems with the concept of crisis is that crisis, just like disaster before the 1970s, is often used in a way that conveys the notion that a discordant situation, like a stock market crash, are blips in the radar of an otherwise desirable social situation. But her argument is that we actually need epistemological shifts. We need epistemological changes, and we have to understand how often things like financial crises are deeply connected to normative desirable conditions. For example, the economic crisis of 2008 was completely engendered by the way in which we think about housing within the capitalist market. And what we need is a dramatic shift in the ways that we think about houses outside of a capitalist market as things that give shelter, right? I mean, we have a housing crisis here in the United States today precisely because we continue to think about houses within a capitalist system of manufacturing and of selling. But that we need is an epistemological shift in the aftermath of crisis. But often, because the concept of crisis or the ways in which crisis is politically mobilized, it upholds the idea that the normative state of affairs that led to the condition of that actually created a condition of crisis is what we want to go back to, right? It's what we want to reinstate, and not have a profound rethinking of the ways of thinking, the epistemological conditions that brought about the crisis. So that what we need in the aftermath of crisis and disasters is often an epistemological shift, but that is not guaranteed. Remember, within the 18th century, the idea is that crisis promises positive transformative change, But in fact, a crisis doesn't necessarily. As a matter of fact, sometimes we can have what I call epistemological intensification. We get more neoliberalism, right? We get more of the epistemological conditions that created a crisis. And finally, Joseph Masco talks about the crisis within crisis, that also as a public, we have been so bombarded with crisis discourse. We have the climate crisis, we have economic crisis, we have crisis in Iran, we have crisis in Venezuela, that this has had the effect of immobilizing the public. That we don't even know where to begin, and the public begins to feel that it really has no agency in bringing about the transformations that are necessary to actually address these. So with all this in mind, and I know that I only have 3 minutes, but maybe that'll be a good cliffhanger, because really all of this is a sales pitch for the book. Right? We come back to the COVID pandemic, right? And in the city of New Orleans, where I live, it's fascinating how when you start using this as your framework for thinking about the pandemic, you see so many things that otherwise you would have probably glossed over, right? So here's an article that was published in the city's newspaper, the Times-Picayune, and we have city council member J.H. Banks, who's talking about the COVID pandemic in New Orleans. In New Orleans, black Louisianians were 2.8 times more likely to die when infected with COVID than white Louisianians, right? And here's our city council member talking about this. He says, for those of us who have been sounding this alarm, it's not new. Again, it's the norm, right? What's new is the illustration of it, like the revelatory potential of the crisis, right? The crise revelatrice. What's new is that people can see it that couldn't see it before. Again, all falling in line with how Marshall Saunders has been thinking about disasters. Now it's slapping people in the face, and you still have people trying to ignore it. So he goes on, the one hope I have is that I will make people pay attention. What I'm hoping is it's not all for naught, that there isn't just a lip service, and when a vaccine is created, we all go back to business as usual, which is what we did. Right? That's what I'm hoping we avoid. Right? Unfortunately, so one of the arguments that was made about the increased mortality of black people in Louisiana during the COVID pandemic, again, it wasn't biological, it was all socioeconomic, right? And it's linked to a long history of white supremacy and of an extractive economy in Louisiana that keeps black people down. Today in New Orleans, the average white family has 13 times the wealth of the average black family. And what's interesting is that the COVID-19 pandemic was not the only revelatory crisis that revealed socioeconomic inequities along lines of race. So did Hurricane Katrina. Right? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, we were beginning to have, as a nation, the discourse that we were a post-racial nation. Right? And that's why many people were shocked. I had friends who were medical anthropologists at the University of Florida who came to me saying, I cannot believe the imagery that came out of New Orleans. Right? I had a friend who worked in Haiti. I had a mutual friend who worked in Haiti. He said, New Orleans looked like Haiti. For many people in the United States, when they saw images of New Orleans, it looked like the Global South, and they couldn't believe that the Global South was here. Right? So Hurricane Katrina was also a revelatory crisis. But, so from that logic, if we were going to have an epistemological shift, then the reconstruction of the city of New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina would have followed one of racial justice. Right? We would have pointed out that the inequities that gave rise to Hurricane Katrina were inequities that had been doggedly supported and maintained for as long as New Orleans as a colony. Slavery was a tremendous crime against humanity that we have never done restorative justice on, and as a matter of fact, we have doubled down in places like Louisiana on keeping black people oppressed. But that was not a logic of restorative justice was not the logic that followed Hurricane Katrina. Instead, what we had was a logic of neoliberalism that simply entrenched those inequities, right? We privatized things. We destroyed public housing. We privatized our one public hospital. And the mortality in Katrina had to do with black folks being more likely to work low-level service sector jobs and being deemed essential, being more likely to be exposed. Black folks working in the tourism economy. Black folks also being less capable of accessing adequate housing in multi-generational families having to live, like all socioeconomic elements. And yet, in the aftermath of the disaster, we don't necessarily see a concerted effort to reduce this inequity, right? So, again, lots of what I saw in terms of speaking about COVID was also this discourse of crisis with guarantee. There was a lot of hopeful hypothesizing that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to bring an end to neoliberalism. And it seems like it didn't, right? As a matter of fact, very, very different things occurred. So, and I know we're out of time, but I just want to close this up really quick to promote the book, right? So this is the edited volume that just came out. Working hand in hand with Virginia-García Acosta as disaster anthropologists, we saw so many things that were familiar that we thought that we should call for, do a conference. It was an online conference during the pandemic hosted by the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of New Orleans. And we asked anthropologists, healthcare professionals, sociologists, journalists across Latin America to respond to these questions. You know, what did the COVID-19 pandemic reveal for you in your own context in Latin America? And also, what does the pandemic tell us about the relationship between the pandemic and social change? Again, the idea that crises are always offer the possibility of social change. You know, what do you see? How did the pandemic play out? What kinds of changes did it lead to in different contexts in Latin America? And we did that keeping in mind that disasters are always contextual, right? So some people feel like they don't have to do field work anymore. A very well-known disaster anthropologist, Anthony Oliver Smith, he went to New Orleans to interview for a job, and he upset some anthropologists because one of them asked him, "Are you going to come to the city and do research and do ethnographic work?" And he said, "Oh, we already know how disasters happen, so we don't really have to do ethnography." And that really upset this anthropologist, right? And the truth is that we always have to do field work because disasters are deeply contextual, and we can't think that we can already have a meta-narrative about disasters. And so we have dramatically different experiences. So the book that I really don't have much time to get into right now, but you know, I always don't plan my time very well, but has different lessons and insights, right? So just let me take you to the main insights of the book. So one of them is, for example, contributors from Argentina, Sergio Bisakowski and Gabriel Noel, who write about how, you know, in the Western concept of crisis and temporality, the idea is that the crisis is a discordant moment. But the truth is, if you're an Argentinian person, you live from one crisis to the next, right? So it's a very different way of thinking about time, history, and crisis. Argentinians are always knowing that there's another crisis around the corner. They're not comfortable within the notion of normalcy because from economic crisis to structural adjustment policies to economic austerity, they live from one crisis to the next, so they don't necessarily have this positive outlook. But one of the things that was really interesting for me were the political dimensions of the pandemic and the response, because for them, the rise of Milei, who is very in line with Make America Great Again with MAGA and the ultra-right wing, that Milei's popularity is deeply indebted, and his electoral win is deeply indebted to the pandemic. The pandemic response brought about a lot of resentment from the Argentinian public. People began to resent the welfare state or the biopolitical state because in order to safeguard our biological well-being, we were subjected to stay-at-home policies. And those work great when you have a federal government that's committed to public welfare, right? So if you can give people money so they can buy groceries, so you can economically support them, stay-at-home orders, shelter-in-place orders are great. But in most of Latin America, that did not exist. In most of Latin America, people didn't get payments like we did in the United States from the federal government. And I know for some people, those payments weren't enough. Some of us got them and didn't even need them, right? Those of us who were tenure-track professors who could teach remotely, right? But in some parts of Latin America, that aid wasn't there at all. So there was a strong political backlash. So rather than a progressive change, right, the crisis with guarantee always promises a progressive change, a better after. In Latin America, it brought about the right-wing movement, right? The right-wing polarization of Argentina that gives rise to Milei. The re-election of this president, I don't think is completely attributable to the COVID-19 pandemic, but I do think it played a role. Certainly, one of the things that we had in this country is that, on the one hand, our federal government and people like President Biden attempted to ease the economic pain of the pandemic through things like federal support. But the problem is that within the free market ideology, they did not hold the private sector responsible, so we had purposeful inflation and price gouging, right? And God forbid that we have an epistemological shift. God forbid that we tell the market, no, You can't inflate prices. You can't price gouge, right? So that's where we did ourselves in, because that led to inflation. That then those were the primary reasons why people voted for this current president. And there was also tremendous resentment, right? Because also the biological illiteracy of many folks that, in the U.S. Also shelter-in-place policies led to a lot of resentment, right, of federal agencies. Amongst, I didn't resent them, but certainly if you're not literate in terms of public health, if we don't properly invest in health education in schools, right, people will have illiteracy, at least, or lack of proper critical thinking skills in terms of vaccines, in terms of ideas of personal responsibility towards each other, right? Of the wearing of masks. I have heard from at least one person at a tattoo shop, a tattoo artist who I know, who voted for Trump because he was required to wear a mask during the pandemic, right? So we were not immune to that either, right? So some of our authors in places like Honduras, for example, our contributor from Honduras, Gustavo Peña Flores, also writes about how the public health illiteracy of the public, or the susceptibility to adhere to maybe folk's not the right term, but to misinformation and pseudoscience, didn't just come out of nowhere. It's the result of decades of destruction of the public sector, of public education, right? To creating basically a biological illiteracy in a part of the population, so that when the pandemic presents itself, people have a real hard time discerning what is reliable information and what isn't. All in all, I just want to narrow it down to the things that come out of the book. That one of the things that I've been trying to argue, and that perhaps not among you all and among your professors, but certainly I think with the public at large, we often think of disasters and epidemics as temporally limited moments, right? And that leads to a lot of policy. For example, I've worked in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where the U.S. Virgin Islands is a U.S. territory, which our president might not know, just like Puerto Rico. And it's also the site of a heinously extractive tourism economy that has created egregious race-based separations between the haves and the have-nots. And the historically black population, Afro-descendant population of the Virgin Islands has extremely limited access to quality education and public health care, right? And that whatever development and whatever governmental investments are seen in infrastructure or in public services often only come after disasters. But after disasters, as they're conceptualized by the state and the public, which means very temporally limited events. And I think that what we need to do is think about them as more temporally expanded processes that begin long before. We got to think of the presence, again, from this perspective, the COVID-19 epidemic doesn't begin or end with whatever happened in Wuhan, right? Whether it was a meat market, whether it was a lab leak, right? But long before the presence of that virus, the conditions that are going to lead to a particular kind of morbidity and mortality were in place. So we have to think about disasters and epidemics as these temporally prolonged processes. That way, the next epidemic, we're already in the next epidemic process. We're already in the next disaster process. This is really important for public policy, because in places like the Virgin Islands, there is a resistance to invest in disaster mitigation before the hazard presents itself, right? We're always chasing the last disaster rather than investing in things like inequity reduction, right? In socioeconomic inequity reduction, or in many other forms of disaster mitigation. So I'll leave it with that. I think this is a big lesson. I think I've gone way over, but crisis without guarantee and different temporalities of crisis. I already covered that. Yep, and I think that's it.
Much for that. We just have a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes for questions, but there was no way I was stopping that tour de force. So thank you again. It'll be slightly awkward, but it works because we're recording this. I will run to you with this microphone, and you can use it while you ask the question, right? It seems to be. The batteries are good. Okay. Yeah. So questions, comments?
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious, I guess, towards these sort of last points about like memories of disasters in communities, and sort of getting to the idea of like how long does a disaster, like are there different ways that disasters stick with populations to change political will, or the impacts both physical, sort of like personal, etc. Just memories of disasters, sort of what the question's around.
Yeah, no, great question. I guess I feel that some collective memory, which is not my area of expertise, but they have to be made and remade and maintained. And a project that I'm really invested in right now is, as I mentioned, the Guatemalan earthquake of '76 is seen by O'Keefe et al. As being, telltale story of what a disaster is. And it had tremendous potential for social change in Guatemala. In the case of Guatemala, in 1917 and 1918, there were a series of earthquakes that were horribly mismanaged by the presidency of Manuel Estrada Cabrera, and that did lead to his ousting from power in 1920. So there have been moments in the history of Guatemala where disasters and their mismanagement and poorly managed disaster response do lead people to transformative social change. Guatemala does have a history of very peaceful revolutions. The revolution of 1944 that brought about the progressive, what's the called revolutionary years of until 1954, when the military coup takes place, was a peaceful protest, right? It was the result of so Guatemalans have had the imagination of bringing about accountability and transformation. And in the aftermath of 1976 earthquake, there was that potential. But there was a brutal clampdown. And one of the project that I have right now is about the memory of that possibility for transformative social change. An interesting way in which the history of disasters interlaces with the history of anthropology is that Guatemala is a country that anthropologists have made million-dollar careers going and writing about Maya people and writing ethnographies. But it's one in which there's also been, I think, a lot of academic extractivism and very little reinvestment. In 1976, when that earthquake hit, Guatemala did not have a single degree-granting institution in anthropology. If you wanted to be an anthropologist, you had to come to the United States and go to the University of Chicago, right? And then have very capitalist ideas about culture, soul taxes, petty capitalism, right? In order to understand the other. But in 1975, and a group of predominantly female law students and history students who were deeply involved with labor organizing demanded that the Public University of San Carlos create an anthropology program. And when that disaster hit, many of those, the first generation was only 5 students, got involved in disaster recovery, but also because of those revelatory tendencies and because they were also already kind of deeply steeped within Marxist literature, they became very involved in the Reconstruction and also revolutionary movements. So that whole first generation was wiped out. 3 of those 5 students were brutally massacred by the Guatemalan government, and the other 2 left in exile. So one of the things that the discussions that we've been having with them, and I'm working with one of the survivors of that, Olga Perez de Lara, writing about, one of the things that she's concentrating in the work that we're doing is talking about the profound militarization the Guatemalan society went through as a governmental response because of the liminality that the state had at that moment and the risk that it was. And the transformation could have happened had it not been for U.S. intervention during the Cold War, right? If left to their own devices, Guatemala could have had another revolutionary transformation, right? So, but that memory has been lost of that potential, right? So that memory has to be made and remade. But that collective memory, the fear that anthropologists have now is that really what we have with the end of the Cold War and the peace accords is the introduction of neoliberalism in Guatemala, the individualistic way of thinking, the loss of collectivity, and also therefore neutralizing the potential for that revolutionary change. I think we had another question here.
I have to go, but
Oh, yeah.
You sort of started to answer it anyways, but the concept of crise révélatrice, if you're having these kind of revelations that come out of these crises, I think one of the really powerful things about your talk is to say we know these things are linked to epidemics. We know these things are linked to disasters. We see it with these these revelations that happen with each crisis. So a question is sort of an operational question. How do we get it operationalized in disaster preparation, in mitigation, in these kinds of things? It was just like an impossible question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. But it's worth thinking about it, right? It's worth thinking about. I think we have to think about who the subject of crisis is, right? And I think more than anything, one of the things that the book does is that it's a call to action, right? One of the things that has happened with the idea of crisis with guarantee is that I think as a public we have largely come to expect that change will come and I don't have to do anything about it, right? It's this idea that there's this organic thing that will happen that doesn't require me to do anything about it. And one of the things that I talk about here, particularly are chapters that show that, for example, biological illiteracy is not just something that happens organically. It's been a project, right? And we see it here in the United States, how the destruction of the social sciences is a project of political conservatives, right? And so political conservatives, I think, and that is why we get into the politicization of crisis and pandemics, right? The erosion of critical thinking has been a project of political conservatives, and they have been much more proactive than progressives. Because I think as progressives, we have held on to this hopeful theorizing of the future, whereas political conservatives have taken, and that's what I say verbatim in the book, political conservatives have taken the historical bull by the horns and bent history to their whim. That's why we're in the mess that we are, and we need to get involved.
How do we get the narrative back?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for your question.
Let us know. I think we could have time for one last question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question was just, I guess, kind of on your first conclusion point on this idea of like, we're already in the stages of building up to the next crisis and we need to install preventative measures. Are you thinking of this like in terms of scale? Are you talking about like national, local preventive measures or like a global?
Certainly it can be national. So I'll give you an example with actual, I don't remember the actual figures, but it relates to figures and I can send you the article that I wrote that links to it, right? So if we look at how do we know mortality from COVID, right? So in Central America, the best data that I've found is based on excess mortality rates, right? Because there was so little testing that was available, it's really hard to tell who actually had COVID and weren't. So the measure that a lot of epidemiologists and public health experts are using is excess mortality rate, how many more people died. Costa Rica was a country in Central America with the lowest excess mortality rate. Why? Because Costa Rica had a very violent civil war in 1948. That resulted from a non-peaceful transfer of power. But the president that had preceded that unpeaceful transfer of power, although he came from the Communist Party, and he instituted certain things like a national social security system, a national public health system, that was properly funded with proper taxation mechanisms that created within Costa Rica probably the best social safety net in Central America, which is not necessarily saying much. But that actually translated. That's translated into so many things in Costa Rica, right? Costa Rica is considered a Switzerland of Central America. But the irony of Costa Rica is that in my days off, at times a few years ago, I was constantly being asked. Not anymore. I think they got tired of what I told them. I was asked by there's this thing called the Foreign Service Institute, which is professors are asked to give classes to people who are going to be working for U.S. embassies and USAID in Central America. And a lot of these folks are working within the constraints of our federal government and of decisions that are made by policymakers. And one of the things that the U.S. State Department pushes upon Central American nations is privatization, the public sector, basically neoliberalism, right? So, and if you look at the work of anthropologists who have worked in Costa Rica for a long time, like Cecil Lowe and also, I'm forgetting her name right now, the U.S. State Department has done nothing but try to erode, right? I don't necessarily believe that a totalitarian communist state is the answer, but what we need is a balance, right? I like bicycles and motorcycles. There are lots of things that I like that I'm quite happy if they're part of a free market economy, as long as they're properly regulated for labor laws and they're properly regulated for environmental pollution. But there are some things that should not be held to market logics, like healthcare and education, right? So what we have is a capitalism that's completely unhinged and out of control. And the countries that have somewhat figured it out are countries like Costa Rica, right? That in Costa Rica, after that civil war, the communists didn't take over. It was part of the oligarchic elite, but the miracle of Costa Rica was that even those conservative oligarchs realized that for a civil war not to reoccur, that there had to be some redistribution, right? That there had to be a social safety net, right? And I think we haven't figured it out. And I think a lot of us, I know that a lot of y'all are very critical thinkers and smart, but if you speak to many people in the general public in the United States, I think they're politically lost, right? We have no compass. And there's been lots of discussions about the role that social media has played, basically in eroding that memory, in eroding critical thought, right? A lot of people are sounding the alarms of what social media consumption has done to the American collective imagination. So yeah, but I think we need a balance, and those are the kind of things that we need to start putting in place, right? That have dividends, that they're social investments that pay off in all kinds of ways. They pay off in terms of healthcare outcomes. They pay off in terms of quality of life, and again, people with higher levels of education have been proven to have the potential for longer, healthier lives, right? They earn more. They also learn how to think about their healthcare, right? So something like education becomes a global health issue.
Wow. Okay, so on that bracing call to action, thank you very much again. And